Hello and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, December 9th. And what we want to do is just indicate a little bit about what we're going to be talking about on our Saturday meeting. And the topic is the drumbeat of war or peace through development. That's not the title, but that's sort of what we're talking about. And what we say, or this is at least the draft of what we've written, to say, while you were being encouraged this week by the independent media to look elsewhere, for example, at the various judicial sideshows, such as the Jussie Smollett and Ghislaine Maxwell cases, the world stood poised to walk another few steps down the ladder into thermonuclear hell. What actually happened in the 2-hour exchange between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden, who, unlike Putin, had Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan in the room with him? The published reports aren't telling us the truth. For example, Vladimir Zhabarov, the Russian Federation Council First Deputy Chairman, in speaking with TASS about his view of the summit, said, "It is unlikely that any breakthrough decisions were made there, but the very fact of the negotiations gives hope for constructive development and establishment of a dialogue. We will hope that Biden will calm down his allies, tell them that everything is fine, that they retain their positions. But overall, I think he will make it clear for them that neither Russia nor the Americans need a confrontation." Conservative American columnist Pat Buchanan said that the United States cannot, quote, guarantee the independence of a country 5,000 miles away that shares not only a lengthy border with Mother Russia, but also a history, language, religion, ethnicity, and culture. Biden should tell Putin the U.S. will not be issuing any NATO war guarantees to fight for Ukraine. Those that believe that thermonuclear war is unthinkable may have a problem with thinking. The LaRouche organization has formulated both a solution and an approach to stepping humanity not only back from the brink of war, but forward into an era of peace through economic development. If you, too, believe in thinking, join our Saturday town meeting to find out what's really going on and what to do about it. So that's basically what we're saying to people about why they should join us. Tonight, what Paul Gallagher is going to discuss is the idea of the Green New Deal as a precursor for, matter of fact, not even precursor for, as a cause of war. This is actually not a new theme. It's actually been one we've been hitting ever since before COP26, going into that flop. And the reason that we were doing it is because the motivation for all of this is what people always say they don't understand. Why would these people want to blow up the world? Or, why would these people want to just depopulate? Well, the answer is because in order to rule, and in order to rule people you would prefer to rule, you get rid of all the people you would prefer not to rule. And that's how you can rule. And the concept of that, which is missed by people who either don't think of themselves as rulers but merely the ruled, or don't understand why any political or hereditary faction would think that way, fail to understand the nature of history and the nature of the American Revolution, why it was both so unique and so necessary. That's something that our organization has worked on for actually decades. It's a worthwhile discussion, and in itself is a topic that might be a worthwhile discussion for another time. But where we stand tonight, in terms of what we both are confronted by, but also what we want to do about it, is really the topic. And so I want to turn this over to Paul now and let him give his presentation. We'll be open for questions, comments, and objections right after that. And then hopefully over the course of the evening, we'll be able to get many of you deployed and maybe also help you get other people deployed to do something about this circumstance. There are things we can do, and we can do directly about it, but not unless we're prepared to consider the actual standpoint from which these matters are posed to us, particularly around the American presidency and rescuing it from various attempts to co-opt it on behalf of anti-American and anti-human interests. Okay, so Paul?
Yeah, okay, thanks. So we're not observing this strategic crisis, as Dennis already said. We're not observing and reporting the danger of war around Ukraine and Taiwan and intensification now to all those people who are listening to the LaRouche movement. We are telling them the only solution to it. We've had a clear description of that solution since Helga's call for now 2 years ago for 4 power or 5 power summits and a modern health system in every nation. And in fact, there's another report just released yesterday from the World Health Organization and the Johns Hopkins Center, which studies this. It's an annual report, which found that not one nation in the world is prepared for the next pandemic. Not a single nation has the public health capacities and practices and facilities to be prepared for the next pandemic. That's different than what they somewhat deluded themselves in their report a year ago and their report 2 years ago. So that solution has been clearly described since Helga's early March, first call for a modern health system in every nation. And even more so since we issued the Great Leap Backward, the special report, and then the mass pamphlets, because the Green New Deal is plainly a path to world war. We should consider the notable feature of the new German government that Helga actually references in EIR. Its 2 most drastic environmental extremists are also its 2 leading warmongers. These are the Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, and the, I guess you call him, Energy, Economics, Environment Super Minister, Robert Habeck. Baerbock, you already know about. Habeck is the guy who put on army fatigues to go to the front lines in the deconfliction zone in eastern Ukraine, and in order to urge on the Ukraine shock troops in their shellings and other violations of the ceasefire there. It's a strange deployment from someone who's supposed to be effectively a super minister for climate affairs. I know from a discussion with a European representative this week that Habeck's new powers are a source of alarm in other countries besides Germany. With one hand, these ministers are anti-carbon, climate extremists. They demand sacrificing the economy, sacrificing reliable power, sacrificing heat, livestock growing, farming, industry to, quote unquote, the planet, unquote. With the other hand, they demand war preparations and diplomatic and military confrontations with Russia and China, 2 of the major nations that refuse to sacrifice their economies to the planet. You could say, to say the Greens are the war party there, that's not to say they want a shooting war with Russia. Rather, what they crave is unchallenged military domination. Domination over differently minded major powers like Russia and China and underdeveloped countries as well. This kind of domination, they imagine, conveys the power to compel capitulation on any policy chosen to be pushed. And if it means that Germany itself and other West European populations are deprived of natural gas for heat and power, having already been deprived of nuclear power and on notice to give up coal, that just doubly meets the Greens' objectives because they want low energy use among other green policies and the lowering of the population that goes with it. In other words, these are the most imperialist of European groups and parties. They follow the policy tradition of Henry Kissinger's 1974 document, this characteristically British document, NSSM 200, which he authored when he was National Security Advisor, with its stricture that developing countries could not use their resources, and especially they could not use them in concert with the Soviet Union, the other superpower of that time. Now, the German Green Party was formed separately during the 80s in West Germany and East Germany, and the fact that both sides of it campaigned against the reunification of Germany in 1989 to 90, when the Thatcher government was determined to prevent that reunification, that's a signal of the British NATO influence in the Greens from the beginning. But this warlike antagonism against anti-Malthusian nations is true at a higher transatlantic level than these two German ministers. We can take the Atlantic Council, which was broadcasting, or rather webcasting, from the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow throughout that 13-day event, down to its bitter end. What is the Atlantic Council? It's the think tank side, or the think tank version of the NATO military alliance, which has marched 600 miles to the borders of Russia. We can take the British Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. In June 2020, again in the last week of June 2021, Chatham House co-sponsored with the International Energy Agency conferences called The Implications of Net Zero 2050 for Emerging Economies. Clearly, conferences issuing zero carbon directives from the British elite to developing countries. Chatham House took the lead from the World Economic Forum and designed policies to compel low carbon steel production, low carbon cement production, low carbon farming, etc., raising production costs in those cases, lowering quality, lowering productivity and production throughout the most basic industries. These policies came in the middle of last year from Chatham House. And what is this in this crisis? What is Chatham House? It's the platform from which their Ukraine Affairs Director, Orysia Lutsevich, and the British Foreign Affairs Minister, Liz Truss, issued threats and calls for British troops to deploy to the front lines in Ukraine. And what is the International Energy Agency? This energy agency, which is constantly projecting zero carbon energy production worldwide. It's a body which is now headed by an official of the Davos World Economic Forum now, but it was formed on the initiative in December 1973 of Henry Kissinger to, quote, advise nations on policies related to their energy mix, unquote. Kissinger hatched this IEA plan at a meeting of something called the Pilgrim Society of London, which is full of the likes of Lord Carrington, George Shultz, Alexander Haig, Paul Volcker, Margaret Thatcher, Caspar Weinberger, Henry Luce, and the U.S. Secretary of State is always an ex officio member of the Pilgrim Society of London. Just the place to launch a global energy policy body, or rather, clearly an imperialist energy resources dictator. That's the IEA. Take U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who rushed out to brief the media after the Biden-Putin meeting with a much more warlike version of its results than came afterwards from President Biden himself. Take this interview from the London Financial Times, with Blinken in August of this year, quote, Blinken says U.S. must lead green energy revolution to combat China, unquote. Now, what's the situation with the so-called Green New Deal right at the moment? Given that we have located it in a decades-long British-led policy of imperial confrontation with the Soviet Union, later with Russia, now with China, and going back directly at least to British agent Henry Kissinger. COP26, the leaders of it admitted it was Flop 26. The resistance of Russia and China and also India stiffened up the anti-Malthusian resistance of the developing countries to the climate colonialism, as it was called by the Bolivian President Arce, or perhaps better, climate imperialism of Prince Charles, Mark Carney, Sir Michael Bloomberg, Ursula von der Leyen, et al. But in the days immediately after that failure, admitted failure, President Biden was deployed to angrily call out Putin and Xi. He said they would have to answer to the world for not showing up at Glasgow. And he announced in those days a steel deal with Ursula von der Leyen for the EC, explicitly to keep Chinese steel out of Europe because it is dirty. That's what they called it. That is, it has high carbon content, which in fact is the mark of high quality in steel. And it was going to be replaced in European use by clean, that is lower quality, but they called it clean, U.S. steel, in the month since the failure of Flop 26. And this is obvious. The military confrontation against China and Russia has geared up into a crisis. As Helga put it the other day, balancing between peace and war at the time of the Biden-Putin meeting. But there's also been another major shift since the end of Flop 26. The Green Deal's demands have suddenly become far more extreme, despite the fact that they were defeated. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, in its latest publication, World Energy in Focus, which it puts out all the time, made the incredible claim that 95% of all additions to electric power capacity in the world in the next 5 years will be wind, solar, and biomass or wood chips. 95%. At the same time, the new German government set the target for Germany power capacity being 80% wind and solar alone by 2040. And to that, the economist Heiner Flossbeck, he responded to that. He said Germany will be 100 gigawatts, 100,000 megawatts short of power every day at midday if it does that. And in fact, even 10 years earlier in 2030, it will be 80,000 megawatts short of electric power every single day at midday on the course of getting to 2040. So it's an economic return to the 17th century. It can't be serious. If it were actually to be imposed in the next 5 years or the next 20 years, the underdeveloped nations would be in total turmoil, starvation, and poverty. China would, of course, be advancing in the opposite nuclear power-led direction and taking as many developing countries out of the morass with it as it could. The opposition of Russia would be absolutely implacable. Our movement would not allow it. This is a policy which requires military domination, just as surely as British policy in India did in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. European colonial policy in Africa required military domination and war, and the slave trade required it during those centuries. It's a caricature, this 95% wind, solar, and wood chips. Remember, the IEA does not make forecasts, it issues advice. That's what it was set up on Kissinger initiatives to do. So it's a caricature. The first mere approximation of this so far have already caused economic chaos, rampant inflation, driven by energy and other commodity prices. Spending on fossil fuel extraction investment worldwide, which averaged about $700 billion a year for the first half of the last decade, suddenly fell to $450 billion a year from 2016 to 2019, and to $300 billion a year, less than half, in 2020-21. Less than half of of it was just less than a decade ago. World liquid fuels production has dropped already from 102 million barrels a day in 2018 and 19 to 91 million now, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That's EIA. That's a U.S. government agency. That's not at all similar to the IEA. Global coal power generation dropped by 14% worldwide in the last 5 years, 10% in the last 2 years alone. That we know, but look beyond it. Labor productivity in the United States and the U.S. and the European economies plunged in 2021. In the United States, for example, down 1.1% in the second quarter, down another 5.2% in the third quarter, down 1.6% for the year ending in September. This is very rare for labor productivity to fall, raw labor productivity like this. New statistics have just now been published on it. The household wealth in the United States is rising rapidly, but for the lower 90%, it is stagnant. For the lower 50% of households, it is falling in absolute terms. Real wages are falling, both in Europe and in the United States. Public opinion about this COVID relief and money printing programs has become dramatically antagonistic where they are the biggest. That includes here in the United States. Antagonistic to the White House over this. This is a situation where the financial elites enlist media and government to generate anger and even hatred of quote unquote adversary nations. But you still have to ask, why are the green dealers doubling down on zero carbon after the obvious Block 26 defeat and amid this growing inflationary economic chaos? First of all, the inflation is what the central banks were aiming at in their money printing over the last 2 years in particular. There's a global mass of debt approaching now $280 trillion, doubled just since 2008, since the crash, growing much faster than GDP, with money supply growing still much faster than the debt itself through central bank printing. This is Lyndon LaRouche's triple curve, typical collapse function, and that collapse of the financial system threatens them imminently right now. They have to inflate the debt away or attempt to do that while creating new debt supplied with massive new cash flows. In other words, a green bubble. The green finance bubble is, in fact, generating super profits. One example, I'll give you one example to make that clear. Ørsted, the Danish company, is the world's largest producer of wind turbines. Ørsted's profits in the first half of 2021 were just a little less than triple what they were in the first half of 2020, at the equivalent of 1.1 billion for the half year. That's profits. Revenue on the order of 10 billion for the half year. Even though total offshore wind power generated across Europe actually dropped because the wind blew less. The tripling of profits resulted from government subsidies on a much larger scale, from sharply rising prices charged for electricity, and from the rush of hundreds of billions of dollars into the green bubble. Take the European emissions trading system. That's the carbon emissions trading market of the EC. It doubled in size just this year from 250 billion to $500 billion trading volume. The price of emitting a ton of carbon dioxide on that market went from $23 2 years ago to $80 this month. This is a new and super profitable derivatives market for speculation. So this is the picture of a global bubble which is generating, at least at the moment, high and rising profits around what are called new technologies. They're essentially cheap throwback junk at high prices. They are spreading like wildfire, and they are dragging down economic productivity throughout the transatlantic nations, which are being mobilized to confront the pro-science, pro-growth, pro-nuclear Russia and China with threats of war. Meanwhile, productive assets outside these real hot inflation commodities and their derivatives are losing value. There was a telltale report issued just a week ago by the New York Federal Reserve Bank. It was called How Bad Are Weather Disasters for Banks? But it has these findings. Weather disasters are not bad for larger banks at all, to put it mildly, but what is bad, quote, our findings suggest that potential transition risks from climate change warrant more attention than physical disaster risks, unquote. That is, the risks from what Prince Charles called at Glasgow the vast military-style campaign to shift the trillions to what he called the fundamental green economic transition. That is what the New York Federal Reserve just surprisingly told the banks is what is threatening them. And the New York Fed is not the only warning of this kind of, this origin of a financial, or trigger of a financial collapse. There's been one in Foreign Affairs, in the Foreign Affairs magazine coming out next month. Green Upheaval, it's called. Talk of a smooth transition to clean energy is fanciful. There is no way that the world can avoid major upheavals as it remakes the entire energy system. You had this investment bigwig, Mohammed El-Arian, from Allianz Reinsurance. He was on Fox News Sunday, 10 days ago, with a warning of runaway inflation uncontrolled by the central banks. He said, we are in an energy transition, and the platform we're transitioning to doesn't really exist, unquote. So that's upheaval, is in the sense that I've just described it to you, in the trajectory that I'm describing it, to a financial crash, is the path, the driver, to the escalated war danger. When we look at the escalated war danger, we should, in the way that Oliver Stone did in his interview a few days ago, keep in mind the mental image of President John F. Kennedy refusing to allow the 1962 Cuban Missiles Crisis to tip into a nuclear war, or any kind of war, with the Soviet Union. Because a president who is as committed as JFK was to scientific crash programs, to technological advances, to economic progress in his country and other countries, will not allow such a confrontation to continue towards war, which could threaten the whole species. And if in this crisis we don't have such a president here, or other national leaders of that caliber on the transatlantic side of an increasing confrontation, what we do have is the unique capacity to keep organizing leaders at all other levels and sectors of society to seize the path to ending the underdevelopment, ending the poverty, hunger, and pandemic disease. The more such leaders we find or create and organize, the greater chance of preventing the threatened U.S.-Russia war or U.S.-China war. So that's the report on this that I wanted to give you, at least preliminary to whatever questions there may be.
Very good.